Useless Monster by Mute Crows. Chapter 30, or Chapter 29. Izuku changed his clothes into a clean uniform, blinking sleep out of his eyes. When he walked into the living room, ready to leave, he found Aizawa reclined on the couch. The TV was on with subtitles on, but the volume off. Marble was loafed on the hero's chest, and he suddenly held up a pouch. It was one of the ones he usually demolished in the morning. Izuku blinked in confusion a moment as he took note of the time on the news station. Way later than they usually would leave, but not so late they would miss any part of the school day.
Take it, kiddo. It's a meal replacer. They're more filling than they look.
Aizawa waggled the pouch. He took it from him with a smothered yawn. After a moment, he reached over the back of the couch and ran a hand over Marble. The cat chirruped happily, purring loudly the instant he touched her.
You ready to go?
Yeah. Izuku yawned again. Were you just not going to wake me up? He asked as Aizawa lifted Marble off of him and set her on the floor. She made a bunch of questioning mews while she was in his arms. The moment her paws hit the floor, she went quiet, then started purring again, and laid right where she was set down. Aizawa shrugged with a shoulder as he grabbed his bag from next to the couch.
I was willing to wait until we would have had to take the train.
He pulled his keys out of his pocket, flipping preemptively to the one for the front door. Izuku felt his face heat up a bit at the mere thought of making someone else that late. It was a vaguely distressing thought, for him at least. Yamada was locking his door as well when they stepped out of the front door. He grinned, saw the pouch in Izuku's mouth, then let out a loud groan. Shona! You cannot get a kid hooked on meal replacement drinks like the way you use them! He was dramatically exasperated, clearly telegraphing his humor about the situation.
Unlike you, we do actually try to be early for the most part. This isn't every morning, though. We just had a late night.
Aizawa didn't look at Yamada as he tapped Izuku's shoulder, much like he had hours ago. Izuku understood immediately that this was gonna be a morning game and smiled a bit as he hopped a step to fall in line with him. Wait! Yamada almost dropped his key in his rush to shove it into his pocket. Izuku didn't look back, instead watching how Aizawa tucked his face just a bit into his capture gear. Come on, there's no way you guys are so excited to get to campus after being up all night! Yamada lamented as he started on Izuku's other side. No, but it wasn't too bad last night, Yamada-san, Izuku said, not sure how exactly Yamada had been imagining one of his shifts to be.
We visited the night market,
Aizawa said, like it was just a simple grocery trip. I see! Must have left early to take the train. Not too crowded, I hope. His grin wavered when Izuku shook his head halfway through speaking. What? We made it a run, Izuku explained. Aizawa groaned on his other side, running a hand over his face.
Did we ever?
But there's a whole waterway between here and the closest night market. At least if you're talking about the big one there is. The confusion was clear in his tone. Yeah, there is. Aizawa-san swore a lot. Izuku looked at the man in question, who still had his hand over the lower half of his face. He was giving Izuku a long-suffering look, but it held no real weight. Do I want to know? Yamada looked at his partner, brows raised a bit.
Midoriya could jump remarkably far when he wants to,
Aizawa answered for him. Yamada considered this for a moment, visibly doing the mental math to figure the distance before he looked thoroughly impressed. He nodded appreciatively and patted Izuku on the back. Kudos there, bud! I don't think many students can claim to have made show here, swear, just with their show of skills. Izuku smiled and laughed just a bit. He only noticed because of the gate in front of him that he had walked the whole way to campus with the two teachers. Thanks, Yamada-san. Nonsense! Credit where credit is due. Now hurry to class before you end up late. He waved at Izuku as he split off from the two inside the gate. They both waved back with a hand raised as they continued toward the main building. It didn't even cross his mind until he saw the hall for the first-year hero courses that he was just walking around campus with Aizawa. This, being something he had been under the impression the teacher was trying to avoid, left Izuku feeling rather embarrassed about the matter.
Don't hesitate to ask for a day off at any point, Midoriya. You're still recovering from things most students here wouldn't have ever considered possible for their classmates to be handling.
Aizawa grumbled quietly, only to turn abruptly to go down a separate hall. Izuku stalled a moment and watched him before he continued to the classroom. Inside, nearly everyone was already seated. They were all talking loudly about different amounts of recognition they had gotten while making their way to UA that morning. He let the sound wash over him as he rested on his folded arms. When asked if he had anyone pick him out of the crowd, he shook his head. No one really noticed him out in public, to be fair. It took a lot of practice to get as good as he was at slipping through people unnoticed. Those who didn't make it as far as the rest in the festival were lamenting their missed chance at pseudo-stardom when Aizawa slid the door open. The bell rang a heartbeat later. They all sat up straight, Izuku included, and silent. A brief scrutiny of them all, and Aizawa nodded. As he approached the podium, setting a stack of something on it, he held up a hall pass.
Bakugo, you are being requested by the office.
He said it clearly, but something in his eyes had Izuku cautiously raising his metaphorical hackles.
Huh? What now?
Bakugo instantly bristled.
I wouldn't know.
His eyes told Izuku he absolutely did, even without direct contact.
It's a direct request from Principal Nezu.
Bakugo grumbled, hands clenching and unclenching angrily as he got up and took the pass in what barely came short of being a snatch. When he was out of the room, Aizawa waited a moment, ensuring their continued silence.
All right, now that that is handled, it is time we move on to the next topic.
He clicked a button and a screen came down partway from the ceiling.
Here you can see how many of you have been tapped by agencies interested in having you join them for a brief internship, and how many of said agencies respectively. These are not your required agencies to handle. Those without any tapping agencies have the base roster they can select from to find one they think will give them the experience they are hoping for. Obviously, we do not plan to send you into the field without a key part of hero identity.
The door slid open and Midnight grinned as she stood hip-canted to the side just inside the classroom.
Midnight here will be helping you develop as well as screen names based on marketability as well as if they are bare minimum work appropriate in terms of being usable by children. As you probably are well aware of from personal experience, children tend to latch on to the idea of heroes, and as such we have to have suitable names for children to look up to and utilize.
Don't worry, you lot of fresh blood. I'll make sure you have fun names. Aizawa would help, but he didn't even come up with his own hero name. She strode to the podium and picked up the stack of what were apparently dry erase boards Aizawa had set there. Fanning out a few like they were cards, she grinned mischievously. Let's begin. The class went smoothly. Izuku decided to keep the name Deku as his hero name, a tiny but growing conviction in his heart whispering that he may be called useless even by himself, but he wouldn't allow himself to actually be as such. He knew without looking that Aizawa was cataloging this name choice away to talk about later. Midnight seemed hesitant, but said it would work. The names were supposed to be a sort of work in progress over the first year, to be fair. When Ida, stiff and without any emotion or animated flair, presented his own name as his hero name, Izuku grew concerned. His friend had claimed to others that he was all right, but Izuku could feel that something was still wrong. He meant beyond the injured sibling thing, too. He doesn't voice this, though. Not yet. Once the class had their names all picked out, Aizawa made a lap around the room to drop stacks of paper onto their desks. There were those who had notably thicker stacks than others.
These are the lists of agencies that range from the base roster for those who did not get tapped this year to the full list of agencies who voiced interest for those who were. Don't worry if you were not tapped this year. It tends to be unusual for all that many to get tapped at all by agencies outside of the typical roster. It's only your first year, after all.
Aizawa very clearly skipped setting anything on Bakugo's desk. The class did not voice the observation.
You will have a week to pick your agency and return your forms to me. No, it does not have to be during homeroom, but do try to keep it during school hours or within the hour after the final class ends,"
he explained as he returned to the front of the room. He picked up his sleeping bag and held it under an arm. He was not holding any spare papers.
"This week, the week following, will focus on free study periods during hero training, so as to encourage you to establish and develop unique routines that will hone your abilities. I highly encourage you to consider unorthodox methods. Talking your fellow classmates to find compatible training partners is also an option. In 2 weeks' time, you will be on your first internship period."
With that, he left. Izuku looked at his list to see that he did in fact have a few agencies who had tapped him. They weren't any kind of large agencies, but it was more than he expected. He felt a lift in his chest that had become more and more familiar to him as of late. He was excited! By the time lunch had come around, he was most of the way through slowly researching the agencies on his list. There were a few he could hesitantly say he was interested in. When All Might waved him down from a side hall, he was more than happy to jog over. It wasn't often he got to see him outside of class during school hours anyway. The revealed interest in Izuku, shown by the man who had personally trained All Might himself, a shock in its own right, was followed by the observation that said mentor obviously terrified Yagi on a fundamental level. It was something Yagi was clearly trying to hide so as to not make Izuku too nervous, and he smiled at the fact. "It's okay if you don't think I should go, sir," he said, unsure what the exchange was even for.
No, that wasn't my point.
All Might squared his shoulders, and his eyes drifted away from Izuku a moment before he softened his stance once more.
The time I trained with him was very difficult for me, for a number of reasons. That doesn't mean he is a bad teacher. He is quite the opposite, in fact."
Izuku waited patiently as All Might took a moment to collect however he wanted to word his thoughts, a natural habit at this point for both of them during their conversations.
"Gran Torino is an incredibly efficient and hands-on teacher. He will be brutally honest and direct, while still forcing you to work out solutions yourself, exactly how you would have to in the field. He wouldn't leave you to fumble and fall if he believed you unprepared as well. You won't be handled with kid gloves if you go to train with him, and on top of that, he knows about One for All. He will be able to help you get a better understanding of it in a different way than I could try to offer you."
All Might held out the slip of paper he had been holding the whole time so far. Izuku took it, looking over the information written on it. "But does he know about... should he know about me?" Izuku looked back up at him, knowing his real question was clear.
"That's entirely up to you. If you don't feel comfortable telling him, then you don't have to, young Bedonia."
He grinned as he straightened back to his full height.
"Hurry to lunch now, though. Your eating schedule is important."
He nodded as he put the paper in his pocket. A bow and he was off to the cafeteria. He looked forward to trying to find information on this hero he hadn't known about. The following week was relatively uninteresting in the grand scheme of the school year so far. Bakugo notably never got a packet of agencies at any point, which the class took in but were smart enough to not comment on outwardly. They all knew by now that whatever led to that decision was something they were not welcome to broach with the obviously seething teen. At one point, there was a distinct shift in how Bakugo acted. For a day or two, he was reserved, contemplative even, in the way one usually sees when someone is standing before a major decision in their life. The mood passed, though, and left him with a set determination that had Kirishima, Mina, and the rest of their small crew feeling bold enough to start pressing. They never got an answer. During the time he had after school, he started wandering the streets around UA with Yagi until either he was ready to go or Yagi had to head off to some meeting or other. When he finished his homework at the duplex, he would wander out the door and through the alleys, learning the quickest ways to and from his new home. He memorized security cameras, fire escapes, large units on the sides of buildings, and all the helpful shortcuts he could. Friday, Aizawa simply handed him a key and told him to start locking up when he walks out. It was important to get in the habit of locking the door for times when night patrols had Aizawa away from the house. Saturday, around lunchtime, he felt the restlessness prickling in his skin. A quick rise of it almost soured his mood, but he was enjoying talking to his friends and did his best to keep it in. They all noticed, though, rather fast, and were more than willing to carry topics themselves so Izuku could focus on eating with few interruptions. On the walk back to the classroom, he sent off a quick text. Midoriya. Paw emojis. Aizawa-sensei.
Got it.
And it was as simple as that. After he finished his homework at home, something Aizawa had at this point said he didn't have to do immediately due to living with one of his teachers next door, but he truly did out of habit at this point. He just got up and walked out like usual. He had the key in his hand to lock up when Aizawa opened the door silently. Izuku pulled his hands back from the door sheepishly as he was stepped around with only a raised brow in response. He didn't have a place he wanted to go to this time, though. If anything, he was just wanting to wander. When he shifted, Aizawa was already on a nearby rooftop and waiting. He didn't jabber or talk this time, really, more than willing to just follow Izuku as he trotted across roofs and jumped small gaps. He just would go to the nearest aches and grab them before continuing to the next closest one. Izuku made it a point to stay on a constant move. He wasn't moving fast, so he would have to stay steady to reduce his chances of being spotted. It was something that Aizawa seemed to appreciate, at least. He took a much longer time before he started to show any signs of getting mildly winded. It was a trade-off, though, it would seem this time around. After a point, when Izuku was starting to feel especially weary, he just sat on a roof and lowered himself flat. He wasn't out of breath, just exhausted. The moon was low on the horizon, and the stars were dimming with the coming light by the time he felt his grip catch. He dropped down off the roof and shifted back practically on contact with the concrete. They had a little less than a kilometer until they reached home, and Izuku wanted nothing more than to just nap where he stood. The adjustment to actually plotting energy for a trip back to his bed was going to take a while if he kept forgetting to, like this. By the time they were a few blocks away, Izuku had given in to the urge to at least lean against Aizawa. He wanted to be sleeping already.
I can carry you the rest of the way, kid.
Izuku shook his head. I'm fine. I've done this a lot, he mumbled.
I know you have, but the point here is that you don't need to do it like this anymore. The whole reason for you moving in is for you to be able to grow and have a stable support to rely on.
Aizawa matched his volume casually. The sky was getting pink. He thought for a moment, but ultimately shook his head again. He didn't voice any excuse this time. He didn't know how to say that he already felt like an immense burden. Aizawa had skipped out on his own sleep needlessly to go with Izuku these past 2 shifts. That and the fact that Aizawa notably had not done any hero work since Izuku had moved in was plaguing him in the back of his mind. He was enough of a disruption. He didn't want to become a bigger one. The sound of Aizawa unlocking the door was incredibly welcome. He took off his shoes and set them neatly to the side. The yawn he let out was echoed by Aizawa, and he almost smiled. Almost.
Get some rest, Midoriya.
He nodded as he wandered towards his room.
I mean actual sleep, too. Not waking up in an hour or so to try and find things to keep up with. Sleeping late.
Aizawa called after him. Izuku didn't answer as he shut his door to change. He knew logically that he didn't have any more jobs. He was traveling around all day to work. Cram school was never something he could afford anyways, so that wasn't even on the radar. He never really had slept in before, intentionally. He finished his sleep routine with an absent mind. As he got under his covers, a fan blowing a gentle breeze over him, he turned the idea of sleeping in late over in his head. It sounded nice, but he didn't know if his body would cooperate. So when he did wake up about 2 hours later, still feeling tired but just naturally stirring, he looked at the light coming in his closed blinds and rolled over to sleep again. When he woke up the next time, it was already starting to get dark out. He could smell food and heard Yamada chattering away to Aizawa, presumably in the kitchen area. He was greeted warmly as he walked out of his room. He hummed as he rubbed his eyes and stood in the threshold of the comparatively bright part of the home Yamada was widely occupying. There was an array of things out on the counter, but he was currently in front of the stove, working on what looked like omelets. Aizawa was standing attentively, chopsticks in hand, over some fish that was being actively grilled. Breakfast? Izuku checked the time again. It was definitely night, so not when he would think to have breakfast. Yep! Figured we could keep it light since you might go back to sleep after this. Yamada grinned as he flipped the Finnish omelet onto a dish next to him.
No, you said you wanted me to make the grilled fish you like because you always burn it by getting distracted.
Aizawa flipped the fish neatly. Don't listen to them! He's just grouchy because I didn't stop at the store to buy him more meal replacement drinks today! Yamada held a hand to the side of his mouth and stage whispered to Izuku. He smiled at the two as they cooked and sat against the frame, legs pulled up to his chest. Do you want to see? Yamada asked as the eggs hissed on contact with the pan. I'm okay, thank you. When the meal was ready, Izuku helped carry some of the dishes into the living room. He wanted to watch the TV on low again. It gave him something to do when he was groggy that didn't leave him even more drained. He let Yamada pick the channel and they all ate in relative silence. It was nice, and like the bedding Izuku soon found himself in again after finishing the meal, it made him feel warm. As the next week proceeded, Izuku turned in his requested mentor form along with the rest of the class. Once again, Bakugo did not seem to be included in the pickup, and again, no one explicitly commented on it. The team was so obviously seething silently to anyone with eyes, though. Regardless, the whole class spent time individually training or otherwise preparing for their time away from campus, home, and social groups to be in the field. As he stretched in one of the gyms, Izuku briefly wondered what exactly had Bakugo so clearly blacklisted, at least momentarily, by the staff from usual hero course activities. It would blatantly impact Bakugo's career path, and... Stop it. He shook his head, frowning as he stood up from the crouch he was in. He shouldn't still have these lingering concerns. Stupid, he wouldn't care if it was the other way around. He sneered. He'd be celebrating. Don't kid yourself like this. When he got back home that afternoon, he beelined to his room. Aizawa had watched him carefully the entire walk back, and it made his clothes feel horrible on his skin. He wanted to peel it off. It felt horrid, and every little bit of pressure or texture or breeze on his skin made it worse. He could feel the angry buzz that was normally so far from his mind started to boil. He shouldn't be letting it bother him this much, but it wasn't fair that he so clearly lost out. He lost out in time, in emotional investment, in mental space, in everything. He was still thinking about it, and he had spent all day telling himself to stop thinking about it. There wasn't any point in wondering if he could do anything to help. He shouldn't want to help. It was stupid. I want him to hurt. The thought was sudden, loud. It glowed with bared teeth as it took center stage in his mind. He grit his teeth as his eyes started to burn. A few rapid blinks and the tears weren't threatening to fall anymore. He should have suffered like I did. It's not fair. He hadn't realized he was breathing as hard as he was, nor that he had stepped out of his room into the doorway until a hand fell onto his shoulder.
Let's go for a run. Yeah?
Aizawa's voice broke through the steam in his mind. He didn't look up from the middle distance his gaze was locked onto, though. He shouldn't be breathing this fast. He knew it. It only made his breathing start to pick up when he acknowledged it, though. Aizawa crouched a bit to look Izuku over face to face, his brows furrowed. A hand caught his. He looked down to see his fingers bloody. He hadn't realized he was shredding them.
Breathe, Midoriya.
He gripped the hand in his. Aizawa didn't complain. He continued to watch Izuku until his instructions were adequately followed. Izuku's jaw felt too tight. His whole body felt too tight. His skin was too much, and he didn't... He pulled his hands away from Aizawa's. It was like a horribly sour version of how restless he got before shifts. The hand left his shoulder as well, both being held in a way that was a clear offer, but also showing it was only on Izuku's terms.
Do you want to talk first?
No! He was tense to his own ears, and that almost made him angrier. He shouldn't be getting snippy with Aizawa. He hadn't done anything. What was wrong with him right now? I wish I could just make him feel it, force him on him like he did to me. He blinked at the way the anger was still feeling pointed aggravated, bristled, and leering, and every bit unlike how he normally is, and that had Izuku feeling abruptly chilled.
Do you want to go for a run then? It can help as an outlet.
Aizawa stood back to his full height, hands still held loosely forward. Whether that was still an offer or just cutting down the distance he would need to grab Izuku's hands again, he didn't know.
We could find something else if you don't want to. It's your choice. You aren't obligated to anything.
I don't want to be outside, he finally said after a minute of standing there and steadily clenching his hands.
All right.
Aizawa looked around really quick before he gestured for Izuku to stay put.
I think I have something that might help then.
Izuku stayed where he was and tried his hardest to not start picking at his fingers again, now hyper-aware of the faint burning sensation of raw skin. It felt like an eternity, and also far too soon by the time Aizawa returned with a large blanket over his shoulders, a sealed Tupperware bowl in one hand, and marble in his other arm.
Get on the couch. Sit in the way you will be comfortable for a while,
Aizawa instructed, and Izuku held in the grumble that wanted to leave him at the idea of sitting down. He did as he was told, and only when he stopped actively shuffling his position was anything done. The bowl had been set down, and the blanket swung to land rather heavily on Izuku. It settled with a firm weight over his form, and somehow didn't make his skin feel like it was being actively assaulted by every fiber. If anything, it felt secure. It felt like it was keeping him grounded in his own body.
What? Not done yet. Just
a breath.
Trust me.
Aizawa carefully set the vibrating form of marble directly on Izuku's chest. She chirped heavily before she started kneading rapidly on the blanket, clipped nails barely gripping the fabric. Izuku felt the broiling energy in his body steadily settle. The steady rumble of loud purring felt as if it was forcing the muscles loose in his body. He brought his hands out from under the blanket to start petting her. He watched as Aizawa turned on the television and turned on the documentary about cats with the volume just loud enough to be heard. What was the bowl for? Izuku asked, tension already well on its way out of him.
It's kinetic sand. It helps when you need something to do with your hands.
He picked up the Tupperware again and sat on the floor next to Izuku. He opened the lid to reveal bright pink sand that looked rather packed in. It smells like cookies, Izuku said in confusion.
I put scented oil in my sands. They can help the mind settle, and also the oil is good for your hands if you put the right amount in.
He raked his fingers across the surface with one hand as he explained. The ridges that formed slowly sank until they settled, not nearly as packed as before. He then held the bowl out for him to take. I just want a pet marble right now, Izuku said as he looked from the bowl to the TV that showed some kind of small spotted cat trotting through leaves.
All right. Let me know if you change your mind.
Aizawa set the ball in his own lap, hands mindlessly playing with the sand. They stayed like that for the full hour or so of the documentary's runtime. The credits shrunk to a corner of the screen as a preview for a different documentary played. Neither moved to interrupt it. Izuku's hands were resting on the now sleeping marble, and he was feeling very tired. When the preview ended, Aizawa started to scroll through more documentaries. It's just not fair, Izuku mumbled. The TV was muted immediately, but the new documentary still played. Something for Izuku to keep his eyes on if he wanted to. Aizawa didn't make any prompting sounds, and Izuku knew it was because he didn't really need to. I don't understand why I still get upset, even when I know that he wouldn't be, like at all, if the same thing happened to me.
You're grieving, Midoriya.
Izuku looked at him, brows furrowed in confused disbelief. No, I'm not! He was angry. He was hurt. Bakugo had not been any sort of friend to him, not since he had started to look for his mother. Aizawa didn't look over, as his hands still ran through the sand. It would have frustrated him if he wasn't so confused at the conclusion. He had felt that he had been pretty clear, even without names, who he meant.
You can grieve a friendship you never had. It's also normal to get angry about it for various reasons.
That gave him pause.
And,
Aizawa continued,
It's alright to be afraid of how angry you got over it. It can be jarring, especially if you view yourself as a kind and caring person. The anger doesn't mean you aren't. It just means you're probably hurting more than you thought and got overwhelmed by it.
They watched the documentary as it stayed on mute. At some point, Marble started purring again, the sound eventually petering out as she fell back asleep. The next one selected was the first preview that popped up, something to just keep the visual distractions going.
Take your time to process it, kid. It's hard losing a friend,
Aizawa murmured before unmuting the show.